There are moments in life when just 1 second is enough to change everything forever. For Gary Bowen, that moment came on a grey Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago when, as he was wiping grease from his weathered hands, he heard the purr of a luxury engine outside his cramped repair shop. The sound was smooth, expensive, and completely out of place in the working-class neighborhood where broken dreams went to rust. For Karen James, the 22-year-old woman who had surrendered 8 years of her youth to metal braces and medical failures, the moment that changed everything arrived quietly. It was the strange sensation of her legs moving in perfect harmony with her body for the first time since the accident that stole her childhood. No applause, no fireworks, just a trembling breath and something she had once believed would never happen. But before the miracle appeared, there had been tragedy. There had been despair. There had been countless sleepless nights when one wonders whether the determination of an ordinary man could possibly stand against a cold, unyielding system, one where hundreds of thousands of dollars had already proven powerless. This is the story of a divorced father living on society's margins, of a billionaire mother carrying the crushing weight of guilt, and of a brave young woman who had grown accustomed to being told, "Accept your limitations." This is the story of how a broken-down handyman accomplished something that money, fame, and prestigious medical centers could never achieve, and it all began with a very simple observation: your braces are fighting your body, not helping it. Gary was not always a divorced handyman living above a cluttered repair shop. When he was younger, he dreamed of revolutionizing physical therapy, just like his mentor, Dr. Sarah Chen. The two used to spend hours in the university lab, studying biomechanics and human movement, sketching ambitious designs for rehabilitation devices that could restore hope to the hopeless. Before that observation was ever made, let me tell you about a man the world had forgotten. But when his marriage to Rebecca collapsed, after their son's tragic death in a car accident, every plan fell apart. On the night he signed the divorce papers, Gary sat holding his physical therapy license, staring at the acceptance letter from Northwestern's advanced biomechanics program lying crumpled on the table. He knew he had to choose. He dropped out of his doctoral program and returned to work at his father's old repair shop, the same garage where his father had fixed broken things until a heart attack claimed him when Gary was 25. Every evening after the last customer left, Gary opened dusty textbooks on kinesiology and mechanical engineering. Not because he hoped to return to academia, but because he believed that knowledge, even self-taught, even without credentials, could still change someone's life. He had no idea that belief would be tested so soon, and he never imagined that someone would appear on an ordinary Tuesday morning, pulling him into a journey that would challenge everything the medical world thought it knew about healing. Where in the world are you reading this story from? And if you believe that stories of second chances, everyday miracles, and ordinary people deserve to be shared, don't forget to follow along, because right after that observation, a choice was made, and that choice changed 3 lives in ways none of them could have ever imagined. What did Gary see that an entire medical establishment had overlooked? Gary Bowen had spent the last 3 years of his life learning to live with the sound of silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes with contentment, but the hollow kind that echoes through empty rooms where laughter once lived. The repair shop on West Madison Street had become his refuge, his prison, and his penance all at once. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now spent his days fixing broken machines when he couldn't fix the most important things in his own life. Every morning, he pulled on the same oil-stained coveralls that had once belonged to his father, Thomas Bowen, the man who had built this shop with his bare hands 40 years ago. Thomas had been a simple mechanic who believed that anything broken could be made whole again with enough patience and the right tools. If only he had lived to see how wrong that philosophy could be when applied to marriages and dreams. The divorce papers still sat in the top drawer of his father's old desk, next to Rebecca's final letter. "You can't fix everything, Gary, and you can't fix us." She had been right, of course. He couldn't fix the way grief had consumed him after their son Michael's accident. He couldn't fix the way he had retreated into work, spending 18-hour days at the rehabilitation center, desperately trying to save other people's children because he couldn't save his own. And he couldn't fix the way Rebecca had started looking at him, not with anger, but with something worse, pity. Dr. Gary Bowen, licensed physical therapist, specialist in pediatric biomechanics, had died the same day he signed those papers. What remained was just Gary, a man who fixed carburetors and alternators because it was easier than facing the wreckage of his former life. but the knowledge hadn't left him. It couldn't. Late at night, when the shop fell quiet and the city's hum softened to a whisper, Gary would find himself analyzing the way Mrs. Patterson from next door favored her left hip, or noticing how young Tommy Rodriguez compensated for his club foot by rotating his entire torso with each step. The human body was a machine, the most complex and beautiful machine ever created, and Gary understood its mechanics better than most doctors ever would. He had learned from the best. Dr. Sarah Chen at Northwestern had called him a prodigy, said he had an intuitive understanding of human movement that couldn't be taught. Under her mentorship, he had developed revolutionary techniques for helping children with cerebral palsy walk more naturally. His thesis on adaptive biomechanics had been published in 3 medical journals. Hospital administrators had courted him. The future had stretched before him like an open highway. Then Michael had died, and the highway had ended in a wall of grief so solid that Gary was still picking himself up from the crash 3 years later. Now his hands, once steady enough to perform delicate muscle manipulations on premature infants, were permanently stained with motor oil. His mind, once sharp enough to devise treatment plans that amazed veteran physicians, was occupied with fuel pumps and brake pads. His heart, once full of hope for healing, had learned to expect nothing more than getting through each day without falling apart completely. The customers who brought their broken-down cars to Bowen's Auto Repair had no idea that the man adjusting their timing belts had once adjusted the gait patterns of children who weren't supposed to walk. They saw calloused hands and grease-stained clothes and assumed they were dealing with just another blue-collar mechanic trying to make an honest living in a neighborhood that had seen better days. They were wrong, of course, but Gary had learned to let them be wrong. It was easier that way, easier than explaining how a man falls from saving lives to changing oil, easier than admitting that some kinds of brokenness run so deep that all the knowledge in the world can't reach them. What Gary didn't know, as he closed up the shop that Tuesday evening and climbed the narrow stairs to his sparse apartment above, was that tomorrow would bring a luxury sedan, a desperate mother, and a young woman whose broken body would awaken something in him that he thought had died with his son. Sometimes the most important repairs begin with the smallest observations, and sometimes the most broken people are exactly the ones equipped to fix what everyone else has given up on. The first attempts were awkward from the start. The prototypes felt foreign in Jennifer's mouth, not sharp exactly, but insistent, as though they were asking her body a question it didn't yet know how to answer. The initial discomfort was expected. Gary had been clear about that. Still, by the third night, the dull ache sharpened into something more familiar and more frightening. Pain had a way of reopening old doubts. Jennifer woke with her jaw throbbing, a headache blooming behind her eyes. She removed the device and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on her knees, breathing through the frustration. She had promised herself she wouldn't spiral, but the thought crept in anyway. What if this was just another version of the same mistake? Karen watched quietly from the doorway. She didn't rush in with reassurances. She had learned that pain needed space before it could be understood. Later that morning, over coffee that Jennifer barely touched, Karen asked a single question. Is it different pain or the same? Jennifer paused. It was different, she realized. More direct, less diffuse. That distinction didn't make it easier, but it made it harder to dismiss outright. Gary adjusted the prototype, then adjusted it again. Each iteration was a small experiment, guided by Jennifer's feedback and his own increasingly careful observations. But improvement came unevenly. One step forward was followed by 2 back. Some days Jennifer felt tentative relief. Other days she felt punished for daring to try something new. Word of the approach spread faster than Gary expected, and not kindly. Colleagues questioned his methods in hushed conversations that were never quite private enough. One warned him that he was risking his reputation. Another was more direct, suggesting that if Jennifer was harmed, the consequences wouldn't be limited to professional embarrassment. Traditional frameworks existed for a reason, they reminded him. Deviating from them invited scrutiny, liability, and blame. Jennifer sensed the tension even when no one said anything outright. Appointments grew quieter. Gary's confidence, once calm and grounded, flickered at the edges. He still listened intently, still made careful adjustments, but there was a hesitation now, a second guessing that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, after Jennifer left visibly discouraged, Gary sat alone in his office longer than usual. The room felt smaller than it had weeks ago. He replayed every decision, every adjustment, wondering where the line was between persistence and stubbornness. He had told them he didn't have all the answers, but doubt had a way of turning humility into fear. What if the critics were right? What if he had mistaken insight for arrogance? The responsibility pressed in on him, heavy and personal. This wasn't an abstract theory or a published paper. It was a woman in pain, a family clinging to a fragile thread of possibility. Jennifer, for her part, wrestled with her own breaking point. She fielded well-meaning warnings from other medical professionals who urged her to stop before things worsened. Some were subtle, others blunt. This is not how it's done. You're taking an unnecessary risk. Don't let desperation cloud your judgment. At night, she lay awake, jaw aching, listening to Karen's steady breathing beside her. She wondered if she had pushed too hard, trusted too much. She wondered if walking away now would be an act of wisdom or surrender. The crisis didn't explode, it simmered. Doubt accumulated quietly in all three of them, pressing against their resolve from different angles, yet none of them said the words that would end it. Not yet. In the midst of the uncertainty, something stubborn held. Gary returned to first principles, stripping away complexity and ego alike. Jennifer kept noticing, kept reporting honestly what her body was doing. Karen stayed exactly where she had always been, steady and watchful, holding space for both fear and faith. The first attempts had not brought relief. They had brought pain, criticism, and a reckoning. But they had also revealed something else, something harder to name, a shared refusal to abandon the question entirely. And in that refusal, fragile as it was, the work continued. Gary drove longer than necessary that evening, letting the familiar streets blur past without really seeing them. The doubts from the day clung to him, heavier now, edged with something more personal than professional criticism. Failure, he knew, had a way of multiplying when left unattended. It crept backward through time, attaching itself to memories that had nothing to do with appliances or prototypes. He thought about his children, grown now, and the years when being right had mattered more to him than being present. He had provided, advised, corrected. He had believed that guidance meant direction, that love meant steering firmly. Only later did he understand how often he had missed what they were actually trying to show him, their silences, their resistance, their quiet attempts to move in ways that felt natural to them. Sitting at a stoplight, Gary felt the familiar sting of that realization. As a father, he had tried to shape outcomes instead of listening for patterns. He had confused control with care. The parallel was uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Karen's voice came back to him then, not from that day, but from an earlier conversation, one that had lingered without his realizing why. They had been talking about Jennifer, about the criticism and the warnings, about how exposed it all felt. "You see me differently than they do," Karen had said. Not defensively, but with a calm certainty. "You're not trying to fix me, you're trying to understand me." At the time he had nodded, grateful for the trust but unsure what to do with it. Now the words settled differently. Understanding wasn't passive. It required letting go of preconceived paths. It meant watching how someone moved when no one was correcting them. The insight arrived quietly, without the drama Gary half expected. He thought about movement, not as something to be imposed, but something already there, shaped long before braces or devices entered the picture. Jennifer's jaw wasn't malfunctioning. It was adapting, compensating, following patterns that made sense to her body, even if they defied conventional ideals. What if the problem wasn't that her movement was wrong, but that everything had been trying to override it? He pulled over and sat with that thought, feeling it expand. Natural movement patterns weren't obstacles to correct. They were information. They revealed where force met resistance, where the body was protecting itself. Instead of fighting those patterns, what if the work was to support them, to create space for them to reorganize on their own terms? The next appointment felt different from the moment Jennifer walked in. Gary spoke less. He watched more. He asked her to move without thinking about the device, to notice what felt easy and what felt guarded. He adjusted not to enforce symmetry, but to reduce interference. Jennifer noticed the shift immediately. The pressure felt lighter, more cooperative. It didn't erase the discomfort, but it changed its character. The pain no longer felt like punishment. It felt like effort. Karen watched the exchange, her expression softening. She had seen this before in Gary, the moment when certainty gave way to attentiveness. It was the same quality she had trusted from the beginning, now sharpened by humility. Later, when Jennifer described how it felt, Gary listened without interrupting. He didn't rush to interpret. He let her words lead him, just as he wished he had done more often as a father. The breakthrough wasn't a solution so much as a reframing. The goal was no longer to force alignment, but to allow alignment to emerge. Natural movement patterns became guides instead of problems, signals instead of errors. For the first time in weeks, Gary felt the weight lift slightly, not because the path ahead was suddenly clear, but because it finally felt honest. He was no longer trying to win against the body, he was learning to work with it, and in that shift born from regret, trust and a father's hard-earned wisdom, the work found its footing again. Jennifer noticed the smell first. The faint mix of antiseptic and coffee that clung to the air as she pushed open the door. Karen followed a step behind, one hand resting on Jennifer's shoulder the way it had for years now, steady and automatic. They had perfected the choreography of hope and disappointment over 8 long years. New offices, new experts, new promises. This place was just another pin on a map already crowded with them. Jennifer adjusted her scarf, though the room was warm. Her jaw ached in that familiar low-burning way, the kind of pain that no longer startled her but never quite faded either. 8 years of treatments had taught her how to live around discomfort, how to smile carefully, how to speak without opening too wide. Braces, retainers, expanders, aligners, each had come with its own language and timeline. Each had failed in a slightly different way. Karen signed them in at the front desk. She had become fluent in paperwork, in insurance forms, in the polite persistence required to keep asking for help without sounding desperate. But desperation had been there all along, tucked beneath the surface. Jennifer felt it more acutely now, sitting down and watching the seconds crawl by. 8 years ago, they had believed the first orthodontist with an almost naive trust. When that didn't work, they believed the next one, and the next. Each failure was framed as a necessary step, a refinement, a minor setback. By the time Gary walked into the room, Jennifer was already braced for another careful, non-committal explanation. He didn't start that way. He didn't leaf through her file for long or lean back with folded arms. He looked at her, really looked, the way someone does when they are trying to understand a problem, rather than manage expectations. "Open for me," he said gently. She did. He watched how her jaw moved, how it hesitated, how it shifted to the side. He asked her to close, then to open again. He listened as she described the pain, the fatigue, the headaches that crept in by afternoon. Karen filled in the gaps, reciting details she knew by heart, the surgeries that had been discussed and then postponed, the braces that had been tightened and retightened, the promise that things would settle once everything aligned. Gary straightened and exhaled slowly. There was no drama in it, no sharp intake of breath, just a quiet certainty settling into place. He met Jennifer's eyes before he spoke. "Your braces are fighting your body, not helping it." The words landed with more force than any complicated diagnosis ever had. Jennifer felt her throat tighten. Fighting your body. It explained so much in such a simple way that it was almost unbearable. 8 years of effort, pain and compliance reframed in a single sentence. Karen leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Gary didn't rush. He explained that Jennifer's jaw, muscles and airway were working against the mechanical force of the braces, that her body had been adapting, compensating, pushing back in ways that no amount of tightening could fix. He spoke about structure and function, about listening to what the body was doing instead of trying to force it into submission. As he talked, Jennifer felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the exhaustion. It wasn't blind hope. She had learned to be wary of that. It was recognition. For the first time, someone was naming the struggle she felt every day, the sense that her body was resisting, that something fundamental was being ignored. Karen reached for Jennifer's hand. Her grip was firm, grounding. They had come here tired, guarded, prepared to add one more disappointment to the pile. Instead, they found themselves leaning in, asking questions, imagining a path that didn't start with just one more adjustment. When they left the office later, the air outside felt sharper, brighter. Nothing was fixed, no miracle had occurred, but something had shifted. Desperation was still there, honed by years of frustration, but it was no longer alone. It was matched now by determination, the quiet, resolute kind that comes when someone finally sees the problem clearly and believes for the first time in a long while that fighting the body might not be the only option. Jennifer told herself she wasn't convinced. She repeated it silently as they drove home, as Karen talked through what Gary had said, as the late afternoon light stretched across the windshield. Skepticism had become a form of self-protection over the years. It was easier to assume disappointment than to survive another sharp rise and fall of hope. Unconventional methods sounded suspiciously like things she had already tried under different names. Every practitioner believed they were the one exception, the one who saw what others missed. Jennifer had learned how to nod politely, how to ask just enough questions to appear engaged while keeping her expectations low. She had promised herself she would never again reorganize her life around someone else's certainty, and yet when she replayed Gary's words, they didn't dissolve the way others had. Fighting your body, the phrase stayed with her, surfacing when her jaw tensed at a red light, or when she caught herself clenching without realizing it. It felt less like a pitch and more like an explanation she'd been waiting for without knowing it. Karen, on the other hand, allowed herself something closer to optimism. She didn't announce it or try to persuade Jennifer. She had learned that hope was fragile and best handled gently. But Jennifer could feel it in the way Karen listened more than she spoke, in the way she reread the notes she had taken during the appointment. Her brow furrowed not with worry, but with focus. "I liked him," Karen said finally, breaking the quiet. Jennifer gave a non-committal hum. "You've liked people before." "I know," Karen said, "but this felt different." Karen trusted her instincts, and that trust had carried them through more than one dark stretch. She had been the one to keep calling specialists when Jennifer wanted to stop, the one to remind her on the worst days that pain didn't mean failure. Karen's hope was never loud. It didn't demand belief. It simply stayed, steady and patient, even when everything else fell away. Over the next few days, Jennifer found herself testing Gary's ideas against her own body. She noticed how often she compensated without thinking, how her posture shifted, how tension crept up her neck. None of it felt revolutionary, but together it formed a pattern that made an uncomfortable amount of sense. Her skepticism softened, not into belief, but into curiosity. Curiosity, she realized, was less dangerous than hope. When they returned to Gary's office, Jennifer was ready to challenge him. She asked pointed questions, pressed on timelines, outcomes, risks. She wanted to know what would happen if it didn't work, how they would measure progress, how this approach differed from all the others that had quietly failed. Gary welcomed the resistance. He didn't promise certainty or quick results. He talked instead about collaboration, about experimentation guided by feedback from Jennifer's own experience. He spoke of small adjustments, of paying attention, of allowing the body to lead rather than forcing it to follow. Karen watched the exchange with a kind of calm attention. This was the alliance she had hoped for, even if she hadn't known how to name it. Not a savior, not a last resort, but a partner willing to work with them rather than on them. The decision didn't come in a dramatic moment. There was no single sentence that sealed it. It emerged gradually, in the way Jennifer stopped arguing and started imagining what it might feel like to try without bracing for failure. It showed up in Karen's quiet smile when they realized they were already discussing next steps. They agreed to try the unconventional methods, not because they were convinced they would work, but because they were finally willing to approach the problem differently. Desperation had brought them to the door. Determination kept them there. And somewhere between Jennifer's hard-earned skepticism and Karen's enduring trust, an unlikely alliance began to take shape, fragile, cautious, and for the first time in years, genuinely alive with possibility. Gary's days began to blur into one another. Morning light found him already at his desk, sketches layered over older sketches, margins crowded with arrows and questions. He worked with a kind of quiet urgency that bordered on obsession, not frantic but relentless. Every line he drew was an attempt to respect what he had finally understood. Movement was not the enemy. Instead of designing something that dictated position, he began building something that could listen. Springs replaced locks. Flexibility replaced force. The mechanics had to respond, to yield slightly before guiding, to accommodate small, honest deviations instead of punishing them. He tested materials the way a musician tests strings, attentive to subtle differences in resistance and release. When fatigue set in, he thought of Jennifer's jaw easing just enough for her to notice the difference, and of Karen's steady presence in the corner of the room, watching without hovering. Those images anchored him. They reminded him why precision mattered, why rushing would undo everything. The design evolved in fragments. A hinge that moved too freely was reworked to slow just enough. A component that looked elegant on paper proved unforgiving in practice. Failure no longer discouraged him the way it once had. It informed him. Each setback narrowed the gap between intention and reality. Word spread again, but this time the tone shifted. A colleague stopped by after hours, curious rather than critical. Another offered access to equipment, no questions asked. Someone else connected him with a machinist who loved problems that didn't behave. The work drew people in, not because it promised easy success, but because it honored complexity. Jennifer felt the change before she saw the new device. Appointments took on a different rhythm. There was collaboration now, a sense that her experience was shaping the outcome in real time. When Gary finally introduced the updated design, it looked almost modest, unassuming compared to the elaborate apparatuses she had worn before. The first fit was tentative. Gary watched closely, adjusting in small increments, responding to Jennifer's reactions rather than a predetermined standard. The mechanics moved with her instead of against her, adapting as her jaw shifted, allowing micro-movements that felt surprisingly natural. Jennifer exhaled, unaware she had been holding her breath. The pressure was there, but it was alive, responsive. Her body didn't brace in the same way. For the first time, she didn't feel trapped inside the device. Karen noticed it too, the subtle loosening in Jennifer's shoulders, the way her voice sounded less strained when she spoke afterward. They exchanged a glance, a shared recognition they were careful not to name too soon. Outside the treatment room, the community continued to gather. Conversations stretched late into the evening. Ideas crossed disciplines. What began as one man's rethinking became a collective effort, shaped by different perspectives, each adding texture rather than noise. The innovation was no longer isolated. It was supported, tested, questioned with care. Gary felt both humbled and energized by the attention. He guarded the core insight fiercely, ensuring it wasn't diluted by shortcuts or overconfidence. Adaptive mechanics weren't a feature to be marketed. They were a philosophy to be honored. Control had given way to responsiveness, authority to partnership. Progress remained gradual. Some days were encouraging, others merely stable. But the trajectory had changed. Instead of oscillating between hope and despair, the work moved forward with measured confidence. Late one night, Gary stepped back from his bench and studied the latest iteration. It wasn't perfect. He knew it never would be. But it embodied something true, a willingness to adapt, to learn, to move with rather than against. As he turned off the lights, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not of completion, but of alignment. The innovation wasn't just in the device, it was in the way the work was being done now, carried by many hands, guided by respect for the body's own intelligence. And in that shared effort, possibility felt less fragile, more durable, grounded not in force but in understanding. The room felt different with observers present. It wasn't hostility exactly, but a heightened stillness, the kind that settles when outcomes matter and opinions are already formed. A handful of medical professionals stood along the perimeter, clipboards tucked under arms, eyes trained on the chair at the center. This was no longer a private experiment. It was a reckoning. Gary felt it in his chest as he made the final adjustments. His movements were calm, practiced, but his awareness was sharp. Every decision that had led here pressed in at once. The doubt, the criticism, the long nights refining something most people still didn't believe in. He met Jennifer's eyes briefly, then Karen's. There was no need for reassurance. They had already crossed that threshold together. Jennifer settled back as the device engaged. The adaptive mechanics responded the way they were designed to, yielding, guiding, never locking her into place. Gary asked her to move slowly, to follow what felt natural. She did, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Her jaw tracked without the familiar hitch. Her breathing stayed even. The observers leaned in almost imperceptibly. Pens paused. Someone cleared their throat, then stopped. Karen had been standing beside the chair as she always did, close enough to help if needed. But something in Jennifer's posture changed. Her shoulders eased, close enough to help if needed. But something in Jennifer's posture changed. Her shoulders eased. Her weight shifted forward, intentional rather than guarded. "I think I can stand," Jennifer said quietly. Karen hesitated, instinct flaring, then stopped herself. For 8 years, helping had been second nature. Supporting, steadying, compensating. She caught Gary's eye. He gave a small nod, not of permission, but of trust. Karen stepped back. The movement was subtle, almost unremarkable, except for what it wasn't. No wince, no reaching out, no bracing pause. Jennifer placed her feet on the floor and stood, fully, independently, the way she hadn't in years without some form of assistance or preparation. Her body adjusted in real time, micro-corrections flowing through her jaw, her neck, her spine. The room went silent, not the polite quiet of observation, but the stunned absence of sound that follows something no one was prepared to see. One of the observers lowered their clipboard, another stared openly, forgetting to take notes altogether. Karen's hand flew to her mouth. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until that moment. Tears welled, uninvited and unstoppable. She watched her daughter take a step, then another, small but unguarded, as if her body finally trusted itself to move. Jennifer laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that broke the spell just enough to remind everyone she was still there, still human, still feeling it all at once. Relief surged through her, not explosive, but deep and grounding. The pain wasn't gone, not entirely, but it no longer defined the limits of what she could do. Gary stood very still. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He watched, absorbing every detail, every alignment, every effortless adjustment that confirmed what he had hoped but never dared assume. This wasn't a trick of adrenaline or willpower. It was function emerging. When force finally stepped aside, someone asked a question, then stopped halfway through, as if unsure how to frame it. Another whispered something under their breath. Disbelief hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Karen took a step forward, then stopped again, letting Jennifer complete the movement on her own. 8 years of habit urged her to intervene. 8 years dissolved in that pause. When Jennifer finally sat back down, the room exhaled collectively. No one rushed to explain or qualify what they had seen. There would be time for analysis later. In that moment, words felt inadequate. Gary closed his eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. This was the moment of truth, not because it proved him right, but because it proved the body had been right all along. And in the silence that followed, disbelief slowly gave way to something rarer, recognition. For a moment after Jennifer sat down, no one moved. The air still held the imprint of what had just happened, as if sound itself was reluctant to return too quickly. Karen felt her legs trembling, the delayed release of years spent holding herself steady for everyone else. Then she saw her mother standing near the back of the room. She hadn't noticed her at first, tucked among the observers, hands clasped tightly, eyes bright with a hope Karen hadn't allowed herself to mirror too openly. For 8 years, her mother had watched from the margins, supportive, worried, careful not to interfere, carrying her own quiet grief at seeing her granddaughter struggle in ways no child should have to. Karen took a step, then another. There was no dramatic announcement, no one clearing space for her. She simply walked across the room, aware with each stride that something fundamental had shifted. This was not the cautious, half-attentive movement of someone ready to spring into action. It was unguarded, present. Her mother's face crumpled when she realized what she was seeing. They met halfway, arms wrapping around each other in a tight, trembling embrace. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. 8 years collapsed into that single moment. Appointments attended, prayers whispered, fears swallowed whole. Behind them, Jennifer watched, and the weight of it finally broke through her composure. She hadn't cried when she stood. She hadn't cried when the room fell silent. But now the tears came fast and fierce, sobs pulling from somewhere deep in her chest. Gratitude flooded her, raw and overwhelming, tangled with relief and disbelief and a grief she hadn't known she was still carrying. "Thank you," she said, over and over, not aimed at any one person. The words spilled out between breaths. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for listening when my body couldn't explain itself." Gary moved closer, not to speak, but to bear witness. He had imagined success in clinical terms, metrics, movement, proof. He had not imagined this, the sound of release, the visible unburdening of a family who had been bracing for years. Karen returned to Jennifer's side, dropping to her knees in front of her, hands warm and solid around her daughter's. For the first time in a long while, Karen wasn't scanning for signs of pain or instability. She was simply there, present in the moment she had once been afraid to hope for. The observers stirred then, as if waking from a shared trance. A murmur rippled through the room, disbelief giving way to excitement, then to something looser, more human. Someone laughed softly, another wiped at their eyes without embarrassment. Applause started hesitantly, a few hands coming together as if unsure whether celebration was appropriate in a space usually reserved for restraint. But it grew quickly, spreading until the room filled with it. Not the polished applause of a conference or presentation, but the spontaneous kind, uneven and heartfelt, driven by the undeniable truth of what they had just witnessed. Jennifer looked around, tears still streaming, and laughed through them, the sound light and incredulous. For once, she wasn't the subject of concern or caution. She was the center of something joyful. Gary felt it then, a quiet, reverent awe. This wasn't a miracle in the way people often meant. No sudden erasure of struggle, no promise that everything ahead would be easy. It was something more grounded, and in its own way, more profound. A body given permission to move honestly, a family released from a long-held breath, a room full of skeptics transformed into witnesses. As the applause faded into warm conversation and embraces, the miracle continued to unfold, not in spectacle, but in connection. And in that shared recognition, it became clear that what had changed could not be undone.